Hi everyone, my name is Essen and you're listening to the Brown History Podcast. On today's episode, our guest is Saket Soni. He's a New Orleans-based labor organizer and he helped hundreds of men who were lured in from India escape what was one of the largest human trafficking cases in modern American history. Crazy, right? This happened in 2006, right after Hurricane Katrina. And Saket just released his book, which chronicles this unbelievable journey. It's titled The Great Escape, A True Story of Forced Labor and Immigrant Dreams in America. And what a crazy, unbelievable story, such an important story, and I highly recommend you check that book out. It's wow. No words. Anyways, it's going to be a great episode because we're going to go really in depth and really talk about what happened and his journey and the journey of these men and America and just yeah, we go all in. So check it out. And if you're enjoying the Brown History Podcast and you're enjoying the Instagram page and everything in between and you want to support, consider being a patron. You just visit brownhistorypodcast.com. Your help really goes a long way. Like it really does. And yeah, let's get this started, and here we go. That's
Great to
perfect.
meet you, Essen. Yeah.
Nice to meet you. I loved your book. I did not know such a cool guy like you existed in
Oh,
the
you're so
world.
generous.
It
Thank you.
was I honestly didn't want to read it, but then when I read the first chapter, I couldn't stop reading it. It is such a moving, incredible story. Blew me away. It's a story that just covers American greed, exploitation, government treachery. I don't want to give spoilers away, but it's also about the American dream, but also about the American nightmare. So I wanted to know, I guess, for our listeners who probably haven't read the book yet, if you can give us some context and how you got involved behind this.
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you for all the kind words. That's amazing. Thank you for reading it. The context is really that I'm a labor organizer and I
Mm-hmm.
was living in New Orleans. I got there right after Hurricane Katrina. Although my story really starts when I moved from India to the United States. I am from New Delhi originally, and I got to the United States on a full scholarship. I'm probably the only kid from India whose parents let him go to America to study theater,
Yeah.
a theater and English major, and was studying theater when I missed an immigration deadline and became undocumented. And I didn't think much of it, but uh, uh, I thought it was a problem that was easily fixable. It turned out it wasn't. And then 9/11 happened. And that experience really turned me from theater and a life in the arts to community organizing. So I was working in Chicago as a community organizer when Hurricane Katrina hit
Mm-hmm.
Mississippi. And I watched TV in Chicago and watched as New Orleans was flooded and watched this, astonishing scene of in the United States of America, people being, um, rescued from rooftops, waiting for weeks to be rescued from a city that was flooded. And I went down to New Orleans to help. I intended to go for 10 days. I ended up living there 16 years. And the story of this book starts in New Orleans after the Gulf Coast had turned into the world's largest construction site. And the repairs, you know, uh, which were repairs of post-war proportions. I mean, there were 1 million homes to be rebuilt just in Louisiana, 1 million more in Mississippi, schools, streets, you name it. Every building was broken up, torn up, and needed to be repaired. And all these repairs were being carried out by immigrant workers from across the country and from other countries. I had started a small labor rights nonprofit and was protecting workers as I could. And my mornings would start at 5:30. My days would start 5:30 in the morning, um, under a 60-foot tall monument to Robert E. Lee, this huge statue of Robert E. Lee placed upon a long column, and underneath it, in its shadow, were hundreds and hundreds of Black and brown workers who were gathered there looking for work. That place, Lee's Circle, had become the hiring hub for repairs all across the Gulf Coast. And every morning, these contractors would pull up in buses, and the workers would get into these buses. I'd clamber on with them, and we'd go out to dark and distant corners of the Gulf Coast, and I'd watch as these workers would rebuild the Gulf Coast, and I'd protect them in any way I could through my tiny nascent nonprofit. That's what I was doing when I got a mysterious midnight phone call that led me to one of the largest human trafficking schemes in modern U.S. history, and that's what the book is about.
So let's move forward with that. You get a phone call, this mysterious phone call, and it's an Indian man with an Indian accent, and I'm not sure if he speaks Hindi or not, but he clearly is Indian, and it's really interesting because I'm sure when we think of labor, cheap labor in America, we think of Hispanic or we think of Latinos, but we never think of Indian. When we think of cheap labor, we think of Dubai or migrant when it comes to Indians. So when you took the call, what was the call asking you? Or requesting from you?
Yeah, it was just the strangest phone call I'd received in my life. I was actually in an unheated car in the middle of the night, trying to help a worker. You know, when you're a labor organizer, your basic job is to solve workers' problems. And that night, I still remember, it was the night of my 29th birthday. And I was sitting there in a car late at night. My parents called from India, from Delhi, and I couldn't take the call. I sent them to voicemail because I was at work, and at work meant I was trying to help a Honduran day laborer ransom his kidnapped nephew. That was the problem I was trying to solve. And so this was a stakeout. I was in this unheated car, and it was a kind of noir scene right out of a novel, with a kidnapper and a ransom that needed to be carried out, and a hostage exchange. And here I was in this car, and the phone was ringing. I was sending my parents to voicemail because I was just too busy to talk to them, and I was imagining them on the other side of the world in Delhi, upset that I was once again, sending them to voicemail. It's all I ever did when they called because I was so busy. And the next caller was calling from the 228 area code. This was the part of Mississippi, the Gulf Coast, that had been flattened by Hurricane Katrina. And I was busy, ransoming this kid from this kidnapper. The stakeout worked. We managed to retrieve my Honduran friend's kidnapped nephew. I went home, and I allowed myself a small glass of celebratory whiskey, a really terrible whiskey I used to drink at the time called Bushmills. And I knocked it back and nearly collapsed. I hadn't slept in 3 days. I was so tired, and the phone rang again. And it was once again this 228 area code. I picked up, and to my astonishment, it was a man who had just arrived into the United States from India. He refused to tell me his name, but I could tell that he was from India from the way he said my name. Everybody in the United States says Saket. Even I do when I'm in the US. But back home in India, we say Saket. And that's what he said. Are you Saket? And he said it first, in English, and then in Hindi. And then we had a quick phone call in Hindi. And he wouldn't tell me his name. He wouldn't tell me where he was, but he said he needed help. And he was pleading with me to help him. And I was wondering what on earth a man was doing, just arrived from India into the ruins of the 228 area code. I would get phone calls from US-born workers, black and white, and I would get phone calls from, as you said, Latino workers from all around the world who were working. But I never got calls from workers from India. And there he was. Well, it turned out he was one of 500 Indian workers who had been brought from India to the US to work for a large-scale Mississippi oil rig builder. And this man and a few other callers put me on the hunt for these workers, and I found them. And it turned out they were among 500 workers brought over in one of the largest human trafficking schemes.
Wow. First off, your life is very stressful.
Stressful, yes.
Yeah.
Full of problems, big and small, but it's very rewarding, you know.
I hope so. Number two, I have listeners from all over the world, and the way America works. I'm by the way based in Canada.
You're in Toronto, right?
Toronto, yes.
Yeah.
So
yeah. Are you from Toronto originally?
Moved to Montreal when I was like 9 months, and then lived my whole life in Montreal. And I just recently moved to Toronto.
Oh wow! Okay,
yeah.
Okay.
Have you been?
I have always wanted to go, largely for the South Asian food in Toronto.
It's pretty good. It's
which I hear is very good.
Yeah, you know what? I wanted to talk about food, but I guess I'll talk about that after.
Sure.
You know, it's first of all, as I said, your life is so stressful and unstable. It's probably the opposite of what any Indian parents would want for their son.
Well, you know, my parents are incredibly supportive of me, but when I announced in Delhi that I wanted to be a theater major, and study literature and theater, they were just about as distraught as I have ever seen them in my life. They pleaded with me, begged me to think about myself and think about do theater on the weekends, but become something else, be an architect, be a, but then the interesting thing is when I got a scholarship to the US, I think they thought, well, okay, maybe this English and theater thing could work. I mean, maybe it'll be hard for a few years, but maybe, he'll work in some university and that'll be stable and he'll be able to do what he loves. And they've always been incredibly supportive. I did theater in Chicago. I was just sort of incredibly poor, as I did it. And then I became undocumented, and that was even worse. I ran a theater company of immigrants and refugees and political asylum seekers. We were all these undocumented immigrants doing theater in Chicago. And then I became a community organizer. So unlike most Indian parents, to them, community organizing represented stability. After
really?
Theater and being undocumented, this was actually a step up. And they were like, okay, that what a relief. That's real work. That's great. And then the funny thing is that when Senator Obama started running for president and then became President Obama, suddenly a lot more people understood community organizing because he had been a community organizer in Chicago. And that helped a lot.
That they probably thought that you could be the next president. I mean, actually, that kind of, or senator at least.
Yeah, well, I think in their unending faith and love and confidence in me, that is completely unconditional, I'm sure they thought I was going to be the next senator of Illinois.
But it tells me also that you don't care about, like, money is not a motive for you.
I think the most rewarding thing is when you get to change someone's life, and there's a way that they become friends with you and family to you. You become family to each other. And although money hasn't been a reward, I think that I think of myself as unbelievably and incredibly wealthy in these incredible relationships that
Right.
I have in the world. I'm just, there aren't too many places where I'm a stranger, because there's always someone um, whose life I touched, or who I came into contact with, and that meant something, and that just turns into lifelong friendship.
And your life feels bigger, I guess, also in the process.
Oh, absolutely. I learned so much. When I mean, the people in this book, for example, when I met them, I was, when I got these phone calls, these anonymous phone calls, from, of all people, Indian men, trapped in a labor camp in Mississippi. I was pretty estranged from India. I was living in New Orleans in a very, at the time before Katrina, even though there was a small South Asian community, there was a Vietnamese American community, but largely the culture was black and white,
Hmm.
and there wasn't really, a deep South Asian or Asian American culture, um, except in pockets. I was carrying a lot of guilt for, uh, because I wasn't really sending that much money home. I had chosen the only profession slightly more lucrative than theater. So, others from my street that I lived on in Delhi were sending kids to Australia and the US, and these kids were growing up and, in the finance industry and sending money home, and I wasn't doing that. And I felt terrible about that. I was, I had lost my Hindi to a large part. It had deteriorated, and so I didn't really quite have my Urdu or Hindi, um,
Yeah.
as much as I did when I was in Delhi, and so I was pretty alienated, from family and from India. And the last people I expected at the center of my life were 500 men from India. But then there they were, and I got these phone calls and I met them. And over the course of the next 10 years, they became some of the deepest relationships that I have. I got to know their childhoods and their love stories, and that was all of the basis of the book. So that's an example of just like, you never know when you're in service of people, you never know where those relationships will take you.
When you met these men, what was the situation?
Oh, that's a really that's quite a story. So,
By the way, I don't want to give it. If there's spoilers that I'm giving away, just let me know and I'll hold back. So I don't know what the balance is, that how much you want people to know and how much you don't want them to know.
oh, sure, no, we'll guard against spoilers.
Yeah.
But what is important for people to know is, I got 3 phone calls from 3 different men. I thought, I imagined they all worked together. I assumed they found my phone number because, my flyers and business cards were circulating all over the Gulf Coast. I would hand out flyers under the Robert E. Lee statue, and a worker over there would get into a bus with with the business card in his pocket, and that worker would get out to Mississippi. I imagined workers meeting workers and flyers circulating. So it wasn't surprising to me that I was getting phone calls, but it was incredibly astonishing that the callers were Indian workers. And so I asked if I could meet with them. Initially, they said no, because they were too scared to meet. So I suggested to one of them, like, could we bump into each other accidentally? Could that be the pretext of a meeting? It turned out these workers, they said they lived on company property. The company completely controlled them, but they had a small, narrow zone of freedom, that they could meet with me at a place called the Secret Catholic Church. Well, they said it was in Pascagoula. I drove out there. It took a whole drive to find it. It turned out, in their particular English, they meant the Sacred Heart Catholic Church. I found it. and and on my way there, I finally called my mother after months. And I said, look, I've got a big problem. I'm meeting with a few Indian men. You need to like help me prepare a speech in Hindi for them, you know? So I did my entire presentation, rehearsed it with my mom, you know, in Hindi, because my Hindi was like a car parked in a garage 10 years ago that didn't work anymore. And I got it to run. And I reached for the door of the secret Catholic church, expecting 3 men and rehearsing my Hindi. And I opened the door, and behind the door, there were 100 men waiting for me from India.
Wow.
I was just astonished. I came in, I did my speech. I thought it went brilliantly, this Hindi speech. I was so proud. It fell completely on its face. It turned out not a single one of those 100 men understood what I said. They were all from South India. I was from North India and speaking, you know, Hindi, Urdu, and they were from South India, and all they spoke was Tamil and Malayalam. You know, some were from Tamil Nadu, some were from Kerala. There were a few men who spoke a little bit of English, and so they said, "Look, can you do the speech again?" I did it again in English. They interpreted it in 2 different languages. And the men asked me for help. And the thing is, I didn't have anything to offer them. So they all streamed out. I mean, these men would have listened to a Harvard-educated American attorney with a law degree and a suit. I didn't even own a suit, you know. Yeah. I had on a tattered hoodie, you know, and I had a theater degree. So they just streamed out. But one of those workers, a little bit later, called me and offered me another secret meeting. His name was Rajan, and he and I forged a friendship, and then ended up engineering the Great Escape in the middle of this book. And what these workers explained to me, what I found out, was these were welders and pipe fitters who were from India. This huge oil rig company had sent recruiters to India, including a lawyer from New Orleans, a Mississippi cop, and a very famous Indian recruiter who wound up becoming the agents, the recruiters for this company. They went to India and they recruited hundreds of men. They promised them green cards and good jobs in America. Now, you know, you alluded earlier, Hassan, to workers in Dubai and the Middle East. I mean, these are exactly the workers who would go months or years at a time to the Middle East to earn money, you know, because they couldn't possibly earn enough in India to afford their parents' retirement or the house that they wanted to build for their parents. You know, they would get married and then leave soon after their weddings to go to the Middle East. These were migrant workers who were from India. And for a migrant worker like that, a green card is the holy grail. I mean, and here were these recruiters, not just a recruiter from India, but an attorney from the United States who came and said, okay, we're going to get you green cards and good jobs. You'll come to the United States, you'll work for this oil rig builder, and in 9 months, not only will you have a green card, but your family will join you, your wife and children will join you. And this was an incredible promise, you know. The only catch was that the men would have to pay $20,000 a piece. Now, $20,000 at that time in India, particularly in India, that's like $500,000, you know. It's an enormous amount of money.
Yeah.
And the men nonetheless thought, well, like if this is a chance, and one of the workers, as he put it later, this was a chance to live with the family you love and provide for them. No Indian worker gets that chance, right? No Indian worker gets that chance. I mean, as one of the workers put it to me, the rules of life for a migrant worker, the rule of life is you leave the ones you love to help them live, right? Your life
Wow.
is this
Wow.
impossible choice, right? Do you love the people? Do you live with the people you love, or do you provide for them? And of course, everybody chooses, providing for them. A good, you know, a good son is one who provides for his parents. A good husband, a good brother is one who provides, right? And so you leave. And so to these workers, they thought this was an opportunity to provide for the family you love and live with them. Something we take for granted in North America, in Canada and the US.
Definitely.
They did not. And so they raised the money. They sold ancestral land. They put their homes up for sale. Their parents sold their homes. The ones who were married sold their wives' jewelry. Their in-laws sold their homes in many cases to raise all this money that they thought they would get back in a matter of 6 to 9 months. They came to the US, and then they found out that all the promises were false. There were never any green cards. They were there on temporary visas. They were working round the clock shifts behind barbed wire fences for this Mississippi oil rig builder. They were living in labor camps, 24 people to a trailer, 24 men to a trailer, living in labor camps on company property that they could not leave. They were surveilled by guards, and they were eating frozen rice for food. They had awful food on site, and they were doing back-breaking labor, but all they had to eat was frozen rice. And not only had they paid the $20,000, which they were not getting back, for green cards that didn't exist, not only were they living in a labor camp, but they were charged $1,000 a month for rent for living on this labor camp. Those were the conditions I found them in when I met them. But, Ehsan, the interesting thing was, on top of all that, the deepest indignities were the ones I couldn't see. It was when I got to know the workers that I really understood the deeper indignities that these workers faced.
Wow. I would assume that since you're Indian and they're Indian, that was enough for them, for you to get their trust. But it doesn't seem that way. How did you get their trust? I love how Indian cooking played such a big part in this.
Yes, cooking was a big part. I mean, actually, the fact that I was an Indian was at first held against me.
Yeah.
They really wanted an American they could trust. And that translated for them into a tall white American lawyer with a briefcase and a proper suit. It was the furthest thing from what I was. But I won their trust in part through my friendship with one worker named Rajan. He reached out to me secretly, and he said, "Okay, I've thought about what you've said. Let's meet." So I met with him at the secret Catholic church. We had a clandestine meeting, and I explained that these green cards were not coming, that the company was lying, and that by then the visas had expired. So all of these men, 500 of them, were now undocumented. Rajan listened very carefully. He wanted to know, what do we do? So I explained the strategy. I explained that, what Rajan and many of these other men were used to was going on strike. I mean, some of these men had gone on strikes before. They had, in fact, been a small day-long strike at this company because the company found out that a few people had met with me and were working with me. And the company sent armed guards into the labor camp to pull those workers, my allies, out of bed in a pre-dawn raid and attempted to deport them. So all of this had happened, before Rajan reached out to me. And he wanted to give me an audience. He wanted to kind of ask me what could they do? And I explained that what they could do was escape from the company in the middle of the night. 500 people, 500 brown men escaping in the middle of the night, somehow, right? And then we could file a complaint, a criminal complaint against the company with the Department of Justice. The crime was human trafficking. We would allege that the company had trafficked all of these workers, which I believe to be the case, and that would trigger certain protections, even if the workers were undocumented. The Justice Department, we believed, would come in, investigate, and while it was investigated, protect these men with legal status. And so the question, of course, was how would the men escape? And Rajan and I set out to engineer this great escape. And at the center of it was food. You know, when I met Rajan, I couldn't boil an egg. I didn't know how to boil rice. You know, are you a cook, Ehsan?
No, I'm not, unfortunately.
Well, we got to work on that.
My wife is, I'm working on it.
We're gonna work on that. So yeah, that's how I was. You know, I didn't cook. I didn't know anything about it. And Rajan explained that I needed to bring him Indian ingredients. He gave me a long list of things I had never heard of. I went to an Indian market. I bought them all. I didn't question Rajan by this point. I knew that he needed, I knew that he needed these ingredients for some reason. And I smuggled them into the labor camp. So suddenly he had these ingredients. He took over the cafeteria and he cooked a meal. You know, these men who had been eating only frozen rice and sometimes stale bread and pizza suddenly got a beautiful Indian meal. And Rajan was an extraordinary cook. And he cooked a simple but incredible Indian meal of dal, yellow dal with mustard seeds. The kind of yellow dal that has fried mustard seeds and onions swimming in it to give it a kind of scent and flavor. That kind of dal with what we call tarka, which is this kind of roasted cumin or roasted mustard seed scent, along with onions that comes through it. He cooked that dal, and so these men woke up from their labor camps one morning with the mouth-watering scent of tarka, flowing through the air. They came out, and that's what they ate that morning, along with real rice. I had parboiled rice at Rajan's request, which means, cooking it only up to a certain point before smuggling it over to him. He was able to cook it the rest of the way. And so these men were eating rice. And that's how Rajan kind of brought them back from a catatonic state of hopelessness and despair about their future. He woke them up, out of a trance, of loss and a destitute trance. And he woke them up, and he said, "Look, we could stay here in the labor camp, or there's a guy outside named Saket who has a different way." And so then Rajan and I started to figure out a way. He had to ferry the workers out so that I could explain their rights and explain the strategy and sign them up for a big case against the company, a huge Department of Justice complaint. So I don't want to give too much away, but that's where the Great Escape started. And it involved lots and lots of wild turkey whiskey as bribe guards. It's this awful, like little mini bar bottles of whiskey, and lots of horrible flavored cigars, the kind you find at Mississippi gas stations. And so those were the bribes for the guards. And, Rajan became their best friend. We ferried the men out. Then we needed a way to get them out all together, all in one night. And we came up with an elaborate but completely fictitious Indian wedding as a pretext. We would talk in code about the wedding. The wedding was always the escape. And we convinced the guards, some of the company officials, a hotel owner, that the men needed to attend a wedding party, and that's how we got them out. And so yeah, again, I don't want to give too much away, but this was, there were, the company had moles. There were all kinds of infiltrators that we had to duck and weave around. But we eventually did get the men out and filed a DOJ complaint, thinking that the DOJ, the Department of Justice, would just launch an investigation in days or a week. Well, we had 500 Indian men hiding in a hotel in New Orleans, but the Department of Justice never came. And so we set out on a march from New Orleans to Washington, D.C., through vast stretches of Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, the Carolinas, all the way to Washington. It was this kind of bold, brave, in the footsteps of Gandhi, a bold, brave move. What we didn't know was, though, that deep inside the federal government, there were agents, government agents, who had their own nefarious intentions and their own corrupt ties to the company, and that those agents were at work, undermining our plans. We had no idea. All we knew was we needed to march, and each step of the way, I needed to win deeper and deeper trust with the workers. And each step of the way, you're right, it involved food. In fact, we got to Washington, D.C., and we were talking to every single lawmaker we could find, and we got to the point where we started to sense that even people who agreed with us were backing away. They didn't quite want to be seen with us in Washington. Democratic lawmakers who were really with us in the beginning were starting to inch away, and we didn't know why. It turned out that the Department of Justice was getting a lot of pushback and starting to resist. And even that problem we solved with food. Rajan and I met, and he made a mouth-watering meal. I mean, basically, every friendship, has its traditions. His and my friendship had gotten really deep, and our ritual was food. Every time we had a problem, we solved it with food. Sometimes when the problems were small, we went to a food truck. When it was a kind of a medium-sized problem or a slightly bigger one, we went to eat Ethiopian food together, and we solved problems by eating and thinking. But the resistance of the Department of Justice, the fact that they were still not investigating our case, and now telling lawmakers that maybe we didn't have as strong of a case as we thought, that was the biggest problem yet. And so Rajan made the biggest meal yet. It was this unbelievable one-pot meal with 22 spices that I ran out for. All these spices went into a pot. Rice went into the pot. Chicken went in, and the lid went on. And Rajan was sort of stirring a spatula and kind of pulling steam towards him with a big spatula, steam coming out of this pot in a little basement kitchen in Washington, D.C. He looked like an orchestra conductor, and the whole kitchen and probably that whole street smelled of these spices, and this rice and chicken came out. He had made this dish that he had learned to make in Baku, in a labor camp in Azerbaijan. It was called al-kabza. Al-kabza is a Bedouin dish, and we ate it, and it was so delicious that we fell into a trance. And while we were in that trance, we realized what the solution was. That we had hit a huge impasse in Washington. For some reason, Democrats and our allies and the Department of Justice were backing away. We needed an assertion of our moral, righteous claim for justice, and the answer was right in front of us. It was food. We decided to go on a hunger strike. And that was the next step we took after the escape and the march to Washington. The next big action was a hunger strike that one man actually stayed on for over 20 days.
Wow, that's a lot to process. When I was reading the book, I assumed that once these guys are out of jail, that's when the story ends. That's very simple, right? But all of a sudden, it's probably the escape is probably the easy part compared to everything else that comes after. Is that a representative of the government in America, or was that like a one-time case? Like, is that how America works, or was yours just like a special once in a lifetime kind of thing?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I certainly expected that the Great Escape would be the end of the story, that we'd escape, we would help these workers escape, and the Justice Department would come in and start an investigation. And once they started an investigation, that would trigger these protections. The Department of Justice has the power, even when workers are undocumented, if they're witnesses and victims, witnesses to human trafficking and victims of human trafficking, that the Justice Department has the power to give them temporary status that comes with work permits. And remember, these men were still in debt back home in India. They had taken enormous loans from violent moneylenders who were now circling their families, and demanding repayment with interest, not just a small interest, by the way, 18% interest loans, that were piling up. The families were being threatened. They were under pressure. Wives were calling husbands. Parents were calling sons, and saying, where's the money? Why aren't you sending us money? And these men were saying, well, we're not working. We've escaped from the labor camp, and we're undocumented, and we're marching to Washington for justice. And the families would say, what are you doing? We need to send us money. So we thought that once the Department of Justice's temporary protections came through, the men would get back to work, and be able to alleviate some of their stress. Well, weeks went by, then months went by. No answer from the Department of Justice. Then we found out the terrible, terrible secret, which was that there were nefarious agents inside the government, immigration agents, basically, agents of immigration and customs enforcement, which is the kind of ICE or ICE. It's the agency of immigration cops, and there were these immigration cops who had, without, again, no spoilers, so I don't want to say too much, but they had deep corrupt ties to the company and were unraveling our investigation. We first found this out when an immigration agent dressed up as a construction worker in the back of a van that was dressed up as a construction company van was surveilling the workers on our civil rights march. We outed this guy as an immigration agent in Alabama and learned of this. The men, by the way, never dreamed of anything like this because, they're from India. They come to the US. Sure, they've been enslaved by an American corporation, but that's a corporation. They had deep faith in the systems of America, in the government in America. I mean, honestly, Hazan, they had deeper faith in America than most people born in America, and they would tell me, well, it's right there in the name. In their English, they would call the DOJ, the Department of Justice, they would call it the Department for Justice. And so they'd say, it's right there in the name. It's the Department for Justice. All we have to do is walk over there. And once we're at their doorstep, doors will open and they'll give us justice because it's in the name. And my job at that point was to explain to them that it is a lot more complicated than that. Generations of people in the United States have had to fight for justice. Yes, the law is the law and the law protects you. But the reality is that you really have to fight for rights that you're already owed under the law. And one thing that helped me was I had a lot of African American mentors who were older, who were organizers from the South. They had been through this. They were no strangers to to the difficulty of getting rights that are already guaranteed to you under the law.
Right.
And so when we started our march, they really explained to the men that they had to, that these men had to understand their opposition. Well, we got to DC, and it was with a great shock that we understood the reason that the Department of Justice wasn't investigating months into our escape, into the men's escape from the labor camp. The reason they weren't investigating was because of these nefarious government agents with their own secret ties to the company.
Wow. It's crazy. It's like a movie.
It was like living in a movie for many years. And then in the writing of it, I learned that it was even more like a movie, because each of these men had these incredible love stories. These were these beautiful characters who, there's this gentleman named Hemant, for example. Hemant was from Delhi, like I was. He was a 20-something. And the reason he came to America was because he wanted to marry his high school sweetheart. And God, what could be more like a movie than that? You want to marry your high school sweetheart. You want what we all call a love marriage, Yeah. And the problem is that his high school sweetheart was in Indian society, was from a place that was several rungs above him in station, in class and caste. And so to win his high school sweetheart's hand in marriage, he was terrified, and he visited her father. And her father said, sure, go become somebody. And when you do, we can talk about you marrying my daughter. But first, go become somebody. And Hemant thought, well, I can't become a lawyer or a doctor or an engineer. But wait, here's this ad in the paper. I can become something even better. I can become an American. So then he convinced his dad to empty his pension, sell the house, take loans, and raise all this money to give to the recruiters. There's another man named Ebi Raju. Ebi he had just returned from 5 years in Bahrain at the start of the story. And he was young. He wanted to go back to work. He wanted to kind of have a young life. But his mother wanted an arranged marriage. His mother was dragging him, kicking and screaming into this arranged marriage that she wanted. She had found him a bride. Well, he didn't want to get married. He was just resisting until he accidentally talked to the woman his mother had chosen on the phone. And just by hearing her voice, he fell in love with her, and now he wanted the marriage. The wedding happened. Well, Ebi left soon after the wedding. His wife was pregnant when he left. Ebi thought he would meet his wife again in 9 months, and his just born son would be with her 9 months from now. That's what
in America.
In America, right? Ebi thought he would leave for America right after the wedding. His wife, according to the recruiter's promise, would join him in 9 months when his son was right about then, maybe a month old, just born, right? Well, it turned out that Ebi did not see his wife for another 3 years and didn't hold his son for another 3 years. The first time Ebi met his son was 3 years old. So those were the origin stories of these workers, these men, and that's also just so much like a movie. All these love stories at the center of the book. And in truth, I always think every immigration story is a love story, because every immigrant story is really about doing something for love, a journey you take for love. And it's about separation, and one hopes about reunion. Not every immigrant love story ends with reunion, but this one does.
One of the coolest things about the book is that, you know, usually the classic immigrant story starts with when my father came to this country or when my mom came to this country. It always starts at like when they arrive. But in your book, we get to see the story starts from India, from back home with their girlfriends and their love lives and their family lives. And the story starts from there and then it continues on. And these are hundreds of people with hundreds of dreams and goals and longings and the need for a better life. And we were talking about how life for you is so stressful. You're in charge of 500, you're in charge of hundreds of Indians in America. You're like the father figure, you're the leader, they look up to you. To me, I mean, that's insane. That must be like panic attacks, anxiety, so much distress. Like, you know, when you agreed to this, how did you know you were up for that, you know?
Well, what was most stressful about it was that I had my own secret in the middle of all of this, which was that my own immigration status was tenuous. I needed to be, well, firstly, I needed to win over the trust of the workers. I did that with great difficulty. I used every possible thing I could, to win those workers over, get them to trust me. But then they trusted me, which meant, and their future in America now depended on me. They were putting all their faith and the dreams of their families in my hands, and that means I needed to be stable for them. Well, the truth is, I was anything but. My own immigration status was hanging by a thread, and that's connected to my own love story, which is also at the center of the book. And that was all very complicated. I was, my future in the United States, my immigration future was absolutely insecure. It was connected to a very fraught love story that was right in the middle of the book that I was navigating. And I didn't know if I was going to be able to stay in the United States. And if I left, then these workers would have no advocate in the United States. Nobody, eating, sleeping, waking, thinking of them, working for them every hour. And that was the most stressful part. I think, I think in the middle of it all, when we were on the road from New Orleans to Washington, marching for the over 2 weeks from New Orleans to 14 days actually from New Orleans to Washington. I would just walk with this sense, I looked brave. I looked like I was in command, but I would walk with this sense of complete dread and fear, because what if we got to Washington and then soon afterwards, the axe came down on me and my own immigration status, ended. I mean, what if the application that was pending that I had pending, the application that I had, not even been able to send because I was too busy with this campaign. What if once I sent it, it was rejected? Then the men would have nobody. That was one of the most stressful things. I had been undocumented already, and I knew the pressures that come on you when you're undocumented. And these men were carrying the hope, not only hopes and dreams of their families, but these incredible debts from the money they had borrowed. So their pressures were enormous. And I would see the way they were on the phone, marching to Washington in a single file against the sunset. Sun is setting, so it's getting to be dusk in America, but families are waking up really early in India. Children waking up to go to school. Relatives waking up to do the laundry or get ready to work in the farm. And these men would have their small little cell phones pressed to their ears, talking to these relatives 10,000 miles away. And they would say, don't worry, there's a man here named Saket Soni, and he's helping us. And I've got faith in him. I've got confidence. The men would build up confidence by invoking my name, right? And all the while I was thinking, wow, what if I'm not here a month from now? That was really the most stressful thing.
To do what you do, I imagine you have to be someone very hopeful and optimistic. And there's this beautiful passage you write about how America and Americans forget and make the same mistakes and cause the same harm over and over, and it's a cycle. And recently, I read that Joe Biden might bring back Trump's old migrant policies, detention policies. And that must for me, it takes away some hope. And I wonder if that does the same for you. And to you, does it feel like things are getting better, or they're not getting better? Or do you still continue to have hope?
Well, I think to me, hope is an action. Hope is not a mood. Hope isn't
Dream.
A dream or something you feel just because you read something inspiring. Hope is the possibility that even in the midst of reality, there's an action you can take, something you can do. So hope really starts with the question, what can I do? What can I do? Hope isn't hope is not a kind of looking at reality with rose-colored glasses and saying it's not that bad. Hope starts with a very brave confrontation of reality. Hope starts by saying, well, this is real. This is what's happening to us. This is what the world is right now, but what can I do? That's a fundamentally hopeful question. And so, in this book, in this story, the first thing I asked was, when the first man called me, I thought, okay, what can I do? Well, I can find him. I can convince him to meet with me. And that was a hopeful action. We now in the world have so many crises, right? I mean, you have Trumpism even after Trump. You have attacks on the environment, and you've got fossil fuel companies. You've got people profiting from other people's misery. And if you just take account of all the terrible things that are happening, it can make you feel somehow that, you're too small. You're too small to do anything about it. But the hopeful way to engage with that is to say, okay, what can I do? And then the next thing to say is, well, I can't do anything by myself. So let me join with somebody. Let me reach out to somebody. Let me stop being an individual and be part of a group. And that's always, to me, where hope comes from. Where you stop being alone. You decide you're not going to go through this alone, but you want to do something, and you connect with somebody. There's an author I really admire named Rebecca Solnit, who writes about hope. And she has this book called Hope in the Dark, and that's I think the way I think about hope is really shaped by a lot of what she's written, which is really about it's not about pretending that there isn't darkness. It's the light you turn on that provides hope. So that's that's the way I go through the world. I think that a lot of people right now feel a lot of despair, and the only time they're ever given anything to do is during elections. But elections don't happen every day, right? You can't kick someone out of office every day, but you can every day join with someone, join a club, join a group, connect with someone, and figure out what you can do right where you are about the thing that's bothering you.
That's beautifully said. My last question is, and we'll go full circle here. How your parents feel about you now with a book and your story being out there?
Oh, my parents are incredibly proud, incredibly proud. My mother has my mother in recent years has reconnected with a lot of her friends from high school from many years ago. That was a while. It's been a while since my mom graduated from high school, but
Yeah.
but she's recently reconnected with all these high school buddies of hers, and they've got a WhatsApp group, and she has been my number one publicist. I
That's
think
so funny.
a
That's
good
hilarious.
portion of my sales have been through WhatsApp to her friends and their relatives and their friends of friends. My dad similarly has been just incredibly proud. My parents are also very powerful readers, so they read. They were the first to read the finished manuscript.
They're in the book, they're in the story, so they're like,
yeah, they're in the book. And yeah, that was interesting. I kind of let them know, hey, listen, you're in the book. And they were like, okay, why are we in the book? We don't need to be in the book. And I said, no, you don't worry about it. You come off really well, but you need to be in the book, and they let me, which was incredibly generous. They let me be in the book, and it was important because my relationship with them and the way I started out estranged from India and from them, and through my relationships with these men, in a way, I came home. That story was so important for me to tell, and so I had to have them in the book. And they treated it initially with trepidation, but I think then they embraced it. My dad did say to me after reading it, we could have been there less. I mean, you didn't need as much as you have us, but no, they were really thrilled and they're very proud, and I'm so grateful.
I'm so happy that worked out for you. You definitely deserve it. I love the book. Highly recommend it.
So thank you. I have a question for you before you
Sure,
end. What's your favorite Indian food, or Pakistani? What's your favorite South Asian food?
My favorite South Asian food is biryani.
Biryani. Oh my God.
Yeah.
Okay, that's great. So I'm gonna send you the recipe for al kabza, which is in the book.
Yes, it is.
It is basically a Bedouin version of biryani.
Oh, perfect.
And it's absolutely mouth-watering.
Are you cooking? Do you cook now?
I cook all the time. Yeah, Rajan, the two people who taught me how to cook are, three people really are Rajan first, and then my mom and my uncle, all three incredible cooks in my life. So yes, I cook a lot now. Yeah.
That's so awesome. I need to get on that.
It's not as hard as you think.
I think it's very hard. It's very, very difficult. I just don't have the, people can be like, oh, this is too much salt or this is too much sugar by tasting it or by feeling it. I can't do that. To me, I need like mathematical like quantities.
Sure.
And I just don't have that. I'm not.
Well, that's
I just
the process.
Does the book help you get, one of the issues? I mean, I know one more question. One of the issues was that you couldn't get the attention of the government or the right people. Does this book give you credibility now and make your job easier now?
Well, one overwhelming thing about the book being out in the world is I'm astonished by how many people from all walks of life, including people in government, have reached out to me and said, thank you for telling the story. And I think that, I think it's an indication that there's just a hunger for these stories. There's a hunger for real immigrant stories that are not just the news where something bad happens to an immigrant or some politician is demagoguing immigrants. I think there's a hunger for stories of people who are immigrants, complex people, people who start in their home countries. They're not born as immigrants, who come all the way to the US or Canada or wherever, and they're trying to live complex lives and full lives. And when you're in government, a lot of people got to government because of stories like these, right? A lot of people got to government to do the right thing because there were people like these in their own lives, relatives, friends. No one, no one goes to government just to work on an issue, and the
Mm-hmm.
job is too hard, to go for anything other than deep personal reasons. Um, many people toiling away at the Department of Justice or inside other parts of government, they go there because they were idealists. They wanted to make a difference, and they saw some level of injustice somewhere. A story of a real person made them go, and people like that have been calling and saying thank you, and that's incredibly moving. Yeah, so this book has helped a lot in that way.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on and talking to me about the book. I have a really big platform, so if you ever need any support for a cause or fundraising or you need to let the news out, please don't hesitate to let
Oh,
me know.
thank you, Ehsan. Thank you
I would
so
love to
much.
help you out. I'm your mom's your biggest fan, but I'm like number 2 in there.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Thank you so much. I love the conversations you have. By the way, a lot of times conversations are too short to go deep. But for example, I really love listening to your conversation with Mira Nair. She's just like one of my storytelling
She's a genius.
heroes,
Yeah.
heroes, and
I'm glad you
um,
like that.
just an example of an amazing interview. So please keep doing it. Please keep doing it. I
Thank you
love
so
these
much.
conversations.